Good morning, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's conversation and the next series here with the Michigan Environmental Justice Conference. This morning's conversation is EJ and Race. The journey continues. Before we get into our presentations, I have a couple of housekeeping slides to go over really quick. I just want to remind everyone that are joining us that all lines are muted for the webinar and that we are recording the webinar. We will have the recording up within the next day for later viewing if you have to leave or you want to share the recording with colleagues. You can have conversations with us throughout the webinar by typing in questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. And if you are watching through the Whova app, you can also type in questions in the questions box there. And with that, I'm going to hand over the virtual microphone to Regina Strong.
Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me real well. I was trying to get off mute and it took a minute. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on environmental justice and race. I'm very excited to have two of what I would consider my heroes of the environmental justice movement joining us this morning. One of the tenets of environmental justice is really to be able to let communities speak for themselves. And the two gentlemen who are joining us this morning have been voices for change for decades. So, you know, I might be fanning a little bit here because I really enjoy hearing from both of these gentlemen. We're joined this morning by Robert Bullard, Dr. Robert Bullard, who is the father of environmental justice. He brings a voice and a perspective of both historical context and future opportunity and action that is really unique, I think, to the advocacy world and really shows us a blueprint of how we can move forward. And I'm also happy to have with us Charles Lee, who is not just an advocate, also a senior advisor to the EPA. So I'm going to get started because there's a lot of information that shows both historical context as well as opportunities for today in our environmental justice work by handing the screen or the virtual stage over to Dr. Bullard. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I think you're on mute.
Oh, yes. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bear with me because it's storming here in Houston. Flash floods are warnings are about. But again, I'm going to get into this talk, and it's really great to be with you this morning. Let me share screen. Why there can be no environmental justice without racial justice. And my job this morning is to connect the dots. And what I've been doing for the last 4 decades is basically connecting dots and looking at some of the foundational theory of social change and how environmental justice research basically is grounded. Much of it comes out of sociology. So I've written 18 books that cover a range of areas and issues. And what I've tried to do over these 40 plus years is to place equity, justice, and fairness at the center of all of the books and all of the research and all of the work. And whether it's dealing with housing, transportation, energy, disaster, food, security, smart growth, land use planning, facility siting, you name it. These 18 books is just one book, but don't tell anybody. And the idea is to connect all of these various issue areas and sectors with it being grounded in that justice framework. Starting in the 1970s, I was asked by my wife, Linda McKeever Bullard, who's a Michigander who grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in 1979 to collect data for a lawsuit that she had filed Um, 3 years out of graduate school, I was asked to do this as a favor. She got me at the best rate, pro bono, free. And so I had 10 students in my research methods class at Texas Southern University, where I am now, and I designed a study to support this lawsuit, Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corporation lawsuit, the first lawsuit of its kind to challenge environmental discrimination and environmental racism. And the Bean case was filed on my 33rd birthday, December 21st, 1979. So my birthday present from my wife was this lawsuit and to collect data for this lawsuit. I did the study in 1979, had it published in 1983. But the results of the study were shocking, revealing. And again, Linda developed a legal theory in terms of how this was discrimination and using civil rights law to challenge this particular facility. And my job was to do the study and collect the data. And what I found from the 1920s up to 1978, 100% of the city-owned landfills in Houston located in Black neighborhoods. 6 out of 8 of the city-owned incinerators were in Black neighborhoods, and 3 out of 4 of the privately owned landfills were in Black neighborhoods. And over a 50-year period, from the 20s up to 1978, 82% of all the garbage dumped in Houston, a city that didn't have zoning then and doesn't have zoning now, was being dumped in Black neighborhoods, even though Blacks made up only 25% of the population. This was a form of discrimination. We went to federal court. We lost in court. The case went to trial in 1970. It was filed in 1979 and went to court in 1985. And in 1985, the federal judge, who was an older white man who was calling us nigras. And I don't know if you are not from the South, but if you're from the South, if you're called a nigger, that's like calling you an N-word. And that judge called the plaintiffs in the case were Black, and the neighborhoods that I identified were Black niggas. Okay, so that was the atmosphere we were dealing with in 1979 to 1985. The 1980s, I wrote a book called Invisible Houston, The Black Experience in Boom and Bust. And out of the Houston case study of environmental case study, I expanded it to include housing, employment, business development, education, to look at the way that Black people in Houston were being denied access to opportunity, access to clean air, access to safe neighborhoods, access to good transportation, access to you name it. Doing the boomtown, which is oil. Houston is a petropolis, and it was based on boom and bust cycles. Wrote this book in 1987, which said the largest African American population of any major city in the South, and Houston is the 4th largest city, over 500 Black people, they were invisible when it came to opportunity. And I expanded the Houston study to look at the Southern United States, because there was just understanding that, well, there's a new South. And I wanted to know, is there really a new South? Is this more myth than reality? And again, looking at environmental issues, economic issues, criminal justice issues in the 70s and 80s. And this book was published by the University of Alabama Press in 1993. And I'm a native Alabamian, and this book was published by a university that I could not attend in 1964. And I went to Alabama A&M University, and I had to travel 300 miles from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state to go to a university, Alabama A&M University, which is the HBCU, passing University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, Auburn University in Auburn, and a number of other white universities. So there was no New South. It took 300 pages to come to that conclusion. The 90s is another era where I was still connecting those dots and looking at the South, looking at Jim Crow segregation, looking at racism. And I wrote the book Dumping in Dixie I finished the book in 1989, manuscript, and I got it published in 1990. And the Warren County iconic photograph that captured the struggle in the 80s was such a iconic photograph. I said that should be on a book, and so I put that struggle on the cover of Dumping in Dixie: Race, Class, and Environmental Quality. This was the first book to document the connection between waste dumping, pollution, and racism. And for 2 years, this was the only book out on environmental justice. And the second book was Dr. Paul Mohai and Bunyan Bryant's book, 1992, Race in the Instance of Environmental Hazards. Both books were published by Westview Press. I said there's something about Westview Press is based in Boulder, Colorado. And I sent this book manuscript around to a dozen publishers and got rejected by all of them, except for Westview. And I said there's something about Boulder, mountain high air, bean sprouts, tofu, marijuana. Anyway, they published the book as a textbook and it got adopted. Um, 2 years later, I wrote Confronting Environmental Racism, because the books earlier that I had been writing were from individuals who are academics, et cetera. I said, I want a book that's captures the voices of people fighting and struggling. And so Confronting Environmental Racism is a book that really takes the voices directly from individuals. And I was able to get some grassroots leaders to write small essays and chapters documenting their struggle. And some of them I was able to get stick a tape recorder in front of their faces and let them record it and then have it transcribed. And that's how this book turned out to be. And of course, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who was led the Warren County struggle at the Commission for Racial Justice, United Church of Christ, wrote the foreword to the book. Spatial inequality is real, and all communities are not created equal. And the Unequal Protection book is actually the first book that Sierra Club books published after even having been around for over 100 years. For example, Sierra Club was founded, I think, in the 1892, something like that, long time ago. This book was published in 93, 100 years later. And in this case studies looking at environmental justice, communities of color, and the relationship between exploitation of land and exploitation of people. In 1994, I asked Charles Lee, who was at the Commission for Racial Justice, United Church of Christ, to help fund a conference to deal with housing discrimination, racial discrimination in housing, redlining, and other forms of unfair housing practices. And this resulted in this book dealing with housing and discrimination. And we know that housing and residential patterns where you live can impact your health. Health and wealth are interrelated. And we know what housing discrimination does, racial redlining does. It steals wealth. It steals equity in people's homes. And the amount of wealth that's stolen is tremendous. And so when we talk about housing discrimination and trying to advance fair housing and equitable development in terms of ownership, it's more than just the American dream. We're talking about transformative wealth that can be passed down from generation to generation. In 1997, my colleagues and I, Glenn Johnson and Angel, Glenn Johnson and I, we edited this book dealing with transportation, racism, as a matter of fact, looking at transportation as a civil rights issue. And transportation has long been a civil rights issue, dating back to 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision that codified Jim Crow that said, yes, we can have separate and unequal, and Black folks, you're going to get separate, but we know it's not going to be equal. And so when we talk about the 90s, that book was 1997 to 2000, we're able to look at issues that were emerging around land use, regional development, suburban sprawl, and we did a case study on Atlanta, because if you looked in the dictionary in 2000 and looked up sprawl, it would say "See Atlanta." sprawl increases traffic, pollution, it creates deforestation, it worsens flooding, creates crowded schools, heightens wealth, income, and other disparities, and it wastes tax dollars. And again, we talk about sprawl and the environmental impact and the disparate impact that'll have on low-income communities and communities of color. And so the answer to sprawl is smart growth. Smart growth means more than just a word. It means making sure that our regions, our cities, and our metropolitan areas grow in a way that's fairer in terms of transportation, in terms of land uses, in terms of airsheds, in terms of watersheds, et cetera. And this is a book that that I wrote and got funded through the Ford Foundation, Growing Smart, Achieving Livable Communities, Environmental Justice, and Regional Equity. Again, expanding that whole idea that place, race, and the politics of place will have a lot to do with who gets what, when, where, and how. And in terms of where investments go, investments for infrastructure to make communities safer, whether it's talking about flooding or talking about protection in terms of trees and green space, all those things. And so place matters. Racialized place matters. And when we talk about transportation, again, we're talking about how money gets spent and investments get spent. And it's a real issue today. This book was written in 2004, but it's as relevant today because transportation dollars oftentimes mean major investments in urban infrastructure. And who gets left behind when it comes to not having good transportation? People are left behind because of not having access to jobs, but they also left behind when it comes to when disasters hit. Not having good transportation could mean life or death. Not having access to transportation also could mean not being able to get to a COVID vaccination center or a test center. So these issues are relevant today, and we saw what happened in Katrina in 2005. We know what happens when we don't protect the most vulnerable population. And again, looking at place, looking at race, looking at the environment, looking at zip code, and looking at zip code being a good predictor of health and well-being. This is a book that we did for the Kellogg Foundation, and got it published through the American Public Health Association. They published the book. APHA Press published this book, and what we show that zip codes are not equal. There's some zip codes that are more equal than others. Zip code can map neatly with life expectancy, and zip code can also strand you in a pollution zone. The communities that are most likely to get polluted, it's obvious which ones. EPA found in 46 states, people of color live with more pollution than whites. People of color breathe pollution that's created more by whites than themselves. And again, the idea of people of color facing more pollution, in this case, Black people, for example, face more pollution than other populations, regardless of what type of pollution. And again, if we move to climate change, we know that climate change is a human rights issue. And so the question is, will the government response to climate change be fair? And in the book, The Wrong Complexion for Protection, it took 300 pages to answer that question. No, not if we don't make them do that. We know that racism tracks closely with how funds get spent when it comes to disasters. And again, money follows money, money follows power, money follows whites. And so if we talk about the implications of racism and redlining, we can see that it creates more flooding. The way that we move people out of harm's way, we have to make sure that justice and equity and fairness, we do not leave poor people behind in flood zones, in areas that are prone to more climate impacts. And so the whole question of just sustainability becomes real. And Julian Agerman and I and a colleague after the World Summit on Sustainable Development came back and said, we need to look at sustainability through a justice and equity lens. That means that it's not just to talk about sustainability, we have to talk about justice, fairness, and equity, and addressing many of the issues that we know need to be addressed and are not being addressed. That's why there are opportunities today to do this right and with a sense of urgency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bullard. You have such a wealth of information, and as you said, one book that you've had to write, unfortunately, over and over again to continue to tell the story from different angles in the same way. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass things over to Charles Lee. He's the Senior Environmental Justice Policy Advisor for the EPA. You're on, Charles.
Great, thank you. Do you see that?
Yes.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be speaking at this conference and be on the same panel with Dr. Bullard. I am just going to build on what Bob talked about in terms of looking at this issue from the perspective of how does environmental justice and systemic racism become an important part of environmental policy. And by environmental policy, I'm not just talking about just pollution, but the entire environment, like people said at the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, the environment is about where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, and so on. So this slide starts as a recent article from the Washington Post talking about the beginnings of the environmental justice movement starting in Warren County, North Carolina, and it features a number of us as part of that early history. In this, I just want to kind of quickly recap the historical roots of environmental justice. Bob talked a lot about that already. Of course, there's the Warren County incident in 1982. And then the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice report, of which I was the principal author in 1987. That was the first study that looked at the demographics of communities near hazardous waste sites. And then and just to follow the thread of history, I was down in Warren County, North Carolina to show solidarity, where I met Dr. Chavis and others at the UCC Commission for Racial Justice. And it was out of that I went to work for them. And also out of that came a request from Congressman Fauntleroy to look at the racial demographics and the GAO did a study that looked at 4 sites. And because I had gone around the country at that time and started to see, all the different ways in which environmental injustice was taking place, I wanted to find a way to really put this issue on the map. And that's what led to the UCC study. That, of course, brought forth or sparked or just kind of unleashed a lot of work that was actually going on in communities around issues in the environment, even though people said that this was not an issue that was of concern to people of color. And all this came together in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. This is the event that codified a set of principles of environmental justice and coalesced a national grassroots movement on EJ. All this, and I'm cutting the story really short, led to in 1994 the issuance by President Clinton of the first executive order on environmental justice. And I guess the storyline here is that environmental justice, as many people say, is the convergence of 2 great movements of the latter part of the 20th century, which is civil rights and environmentalism. So building on those historical roots, I want to kind of trace the EJ's historical arc going from then to today. And of course, we start, and this is kind of tracing how environmental justice became part of the national mainstream dialogue. And we start with Hurricane Katrina, where the issue, the undeniable racism and the undeniable ways in which African Americans were being treated there was brought to the attention of people across the country. That was reinforced and seared into the American consciousness through the Flint water crisis, and that was at that point first time that EJ became really a big part of the mainstream national political discourse. This was all brought home to everyone across on all parts of the country through the COVID pandemic, which, as many people say, is a lot more than just a pandemic; it's a syndemic. And you can see in the little graphic I put in here about how this is interrelated in terms of the disproportionate impacts on the of COVID on the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. So this has led to this, because of all this, is now no longer acceptable that EJ is considered just an afterthought, and this is highlighted by the recent court case in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals around the Buckingham County, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline compressor station. And the opinion had this famous quote in there about how environmental justice is not just a box to be checked kind of exercise. You just don't hold a couple of meetings, or you just don't do a screening run and then kind of check the box and you say you've taken care of the issue. It has is a lot deeper than that, and this is something that you have to think about up front and integrate it into all that you think about when you start to look at EJ situations and do EJ analysis. So after the police killing of George Floyd last summer, we started a conversation, and I put forward to people at EPA this question of why is structural racism relevant to the mission of EPA? And I think that it was cut off for a little while, but it continues today in a much bigger way. And we've been able to take this question and try to highlight it through many different forums, including a webinar series on EJ and systemic racism. The rest of this presentation now kind of go into the specifics of this. So I had said before that when you look at the disproportionate the pandemic and the science of the disproportionate environmental health impacts, with the drivers in the built environment, the national environment, and the social environment, that there is actually that's a good way to think about what environmental justice is all about. And here you can see the relationships between air pollution and COVID and the social determinants of health. The important thing to take away from this this graphic is the fact that this is not just something that makes sense logically, but there's evidence to the fact. For example, that the recent Harvard School of Public Health study on the correlation between PM 2.5 exposure and COVID mortality. And we all know that PM 2.5 is disproportionately impacts African American and people of color communities. Taking this and looking at this issue in a different way, a recent resource that was created by a project called Mapping Inequality, which made available the shapefiles for about 200 cities of the redlining maps from the 1930s, has become a resource. And this is an example of how it's been used by California EPA by overlaying it with the results of the of Cal EPA's environmental justice cumulative impacts map. And you can see here then the direct relationship between areas which were redlined, or the ones that are in the worst areas, the most hazardous areas, and then the ones where people of color were steered towards, and the environmental quality today. And you can see that not only in terms of the relationship between the worse off areas, but also the well off areas. There's a lot to be said about this, which I don't think we have time to do. However, one thing to point out about that database, which is actually accessible to anyone across the country, is that they had put into the verbatim text of the surveyor's descriptions of the red line areas in the 1930s, which you can read for yourself, and they're pretty clear exactly, and it's pretty clear that these were decisions that were made with very conscious understanding of what the environmental conditions were. And as we all know, redlining was a conscious decision of the federal government, this is well described in a book by Richard Rothstein called "The Color of Law," and something that is repeated across the country in so many different ways. The one thing that has led to is a outburst of new research that looks at these red line areas and environmental health outcomes, and this is just examples of some of them that show the relationship between redlining and neighborhood health by the Neighborhood Community Redevelopment Corporation. One that looked at the correlation between redline areas and the location of urban heat islands was published in 2020, and that you could see not only is there a relationship, but it is also able to be explained by things like less green space or tree cover or impervious surfaces. Translating this now into what this means in terms of how we analyze for environmental justice, I thought that the recent complaint that was issued, that was made by the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center was a really great example. It speaks to the U.S. ecology case, this siting case in Detroit, and the issue of waste sites through in that area. And so to recap it quickly, you see the differences in terms of the percentage of population of people of color in the host and non-host communities. The fact that 94% of the waste that goes into Wayne County comes from out of the county, across the state and across the country and even internationally. And then the cumulative impacts that are affecting those the communities in Wayne County through the use of the indices or the indicators in EJ Screen. Along with that, there's a robust discussion of the historical roots of this environmental injustice and issues like redlining and segregation, redlining, and other factors. These and you can see the overlay of this in this particular graphic. Not only is this an urban phenomenon, but also one that affects rural areas. And of course, we know that the original forms of this goes back into the just very beginnings of this country in terms of its impact on Native Americans and indigenous people. But this shows you it's a study that looks at disadvantaged unincorporated areas, and these are the areas where our communities that are lacking water and drinking water and other infrastructure lying on the are in the unincorporated and lacking those areas. One thing to note about this is that some 60% of those that are looked at in this study are actually within 1 mile of areas with water infrastructure. And these are essentially those little townships outside of the area where people of color end up in. This is seen not only through migrant communities in California, but communities in the Deep South and in Louisiana and other parts of the country. Another way to look at this would be then the study that found a correlation between the ambient air toxics and lifetime cancer risk. And Rachel Morello-Frosch, who's the principal author of the study, found that not only is this taking place across for all population groups, but for metropolitan areas as a whole. And here, I think this is really important because this can be used to now look at, say, how do these social factors actually, have an impact in terms of environmental outcomes. And I want to kind of close out this with this TED talk around from anthropologist Stephen DeBerry around why is the wrong side of the tracks usually on the east side of the cities, and that is simply because of the prevailing wind patterns makes the wind goes west to east, and so when and therefore these are the areas that are downwind from pollution, and therefore you end up with areas like East Palo Alto, where Dr. DeBerry comes from, or East St. Louis, or East Houston, or East Austin, and so on and so forth. This is not something that is this is something that has actually been quantified, and an example of that study is shown here on the bottom right-hand side of the slides. So I want to pose this question: when we sent our 1987 report to EPA, they responded by saying that EPA deals only with issues of technology, not sociology. But I think both my and Dr. Buller's talk really illustrate how these social contexts are huge drivers of environmental quality. And so therefore, making sure there's a space to truly consider these when we're talking about analyses and environmental decision-making is something that the time is overdue for something like that to happen. The confluence of this conversation around systemic racism, particularly after the death of George Floyd, and the environmental justice movement is coming together. And one of the examples of how that took place and what that has led to is the recent landmark law around environmental justice and cumulative impacts in New Jersey. And you can read for yourself what the author of this article about how a long-stalled Holy Grail environmental justice bill found its moment in New Jersey during a fraught political season that has laid bare the connections between historically racist government policies and current environmental public health inequities. The same has been taking place on the national level, leading to President Biden's issuance of these four these 3 executive orders, the 1 presidential memo around racial equity, around protecting public health and environment by restoring science, by tackling the community climate crisis at home and abroad. These has, among the many things that it's called for, is the establishment of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, a White House Interagency Council, and a Justice 40 initiative, which mandates that 40% of federal resources go to benefit disadvantaged communities and the development of a climate and economic justice screening tool. I want to end by posing to the audience a set of issues that people should be thinking about in their own work, particularly those that work in government. And that has to do with looking for, these are conscious decisions and policies that have been made that has led to these outcomes. And we can, if that is the case, we can identify them and address them and transform the work and the conditions that grow out of that. And these take place in issues like how communities or inequities in terms of participation in decision making, in terms of investments of resources, and the development and implementation of regulations. So I'll stop there, Regina.
Thank you so much, Charles. That's a lot of information, really good information. Thank you for sharing. I want to address, I know we are in our last couple minutes, and there were a couple questions in the chat in our Q&A. In particular, there was a question around transportation and racism that Dr. Bullard, you said you wanted to answer live. So if you want to come off mute and address that question, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the way that we spend our transportation dollars and investments can disadvantage communities. Highways that run through Black and brown communities that destroy business corridors and economic development centers. It's real. It happened decades ago, and it's happening right now. A classic example is what's happening in Africatown in Mobile, Alabama, an attempt to build a bridge, a highway through this historic Black community, last place where enslaved Africans were dropped off. And this is going on right now. This is real, and we need to fight it wherever it is. Getting access to transportation means a lot. In some cases, could mean the difference between life and death. Getting access to a job, getting access to a hospital. And as I said before, there's a study showing that Black people have to travel farther distances to get to a vaccination center, but the assumption is that you have a car. And so the idea that transportation justice and transportation equity definitely need to get into the infrastructure bill and all of the jobs bill and all of the federal policies that's talking about building back better. Need to build back stronger and build back fairer.
So thank you for addressing that. I know we're right up against time. We could probably answer a lot of these questions over the next 20 minutes if we had that much time. So thank you both for being part of this conversation. We will respond in writing to some of the questions in the Q&A, as many of them can. We want to, as many presentations as we get, we will make those available. So thank you again, Dr. Bullard and Charles, for being with us this afternoon, and everyone else. I think we have some housekeeping things in the last 30 seconds left, if you want to jump on and share those.
Certainly. Thank you to the presenters. This whole conversation was very rich. So I want to remind all of our attendees that this webinar is recorded. We will get the recording up and loaded to you hopefully before the end of the day today. There's been a lot of requests for information in the chat. So we just want to let you know, just stay tuned for this webinar recording. Coming up next today at 12:15, we will hear from our governor from the state of Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer will be our keynote speaker at 12:15. So stick around for that. Anything further, Regina?
That's it. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you again at the next session. And thanks once again, Dr. Bullard and Charles Lee.